The morning sun barely peeped through London's typical grey clouds as Sarah Chen stood in her small hotel room, carefully applying her makeup. Her hands trembled slightly with excitement as she checked her phone for the 100th time. 7:30 a.m. She had been planning this day for months, ever since she saved enough money from her part-time job at a Singapore coffee shop to make this dream trip to London. Sarah wasn't like most tourists. While others planned visits to the London Eye or Big Ben, her heart was set on one specific destination: Buckingham Palace. Growing up in a small apartment in Singapore, she had spent countless hours watching documentaries about the British royal family and their traditions. The royal guards, in particular, fascinated her. Their red uniforms, tall bearskin hats, and unwavering discipline seemed almost magical to her. As she walked through the chilly December morning, Sarah clutched her travel guide tightly. The streets of London were quieter than usual, with only a few early morning workers hurrying past her. She had deliberately chosen to visit during the off-season, hoping for smaller crowds. Her breath formed small clouds in the cold air as she followed her phone's GPS, turning down one historic street after another. The closer she got to the palace, the faster her heart beat. She wasn't alone in her early morning journey. Other tourists, wrapped in thick coats and scarves, were heading in the same direction. Sarah overheard snippets of conversations in various languages: French, German, Japanese, all sharing her excitement. At the palace gates, Sarah joined the growing crowd. She positioned herself carefully, wanting the perfect view of the guards. The tourist beside her, an elderly American woman named Martha, noticed Sarah's enthusiasm and struck up a conversation. "First time here, dear?" Martha asked kindly. Sarah nodded, her eyes never leaving the palace grounds. "I've been saving for this trip for 2 years," she replied, her Singaporean accent mixing with her careful English. "I've watched every documentary about the royal guards. Did you know they train for 6 months before they can stand duty?" Martha smiled at the young girl's enthusiasm. "You certainly know your facts." As they talked, more tourists gathered around them. The morning grew slightly warmer, but Sarah barely noticed the cold. She was too busy taking photos with her phone, capturing every detail of the palace's magnificent architecture. The golden gates gleamed in the weak winter sunlight, and the Victorian architecture of the palace looked even more impressive in real life than it had in pictures. Then, at exactly 9 o'clock a.m., the moment Sarah had been waiting for arrived. The royal guards began their morning ceremony. Their red uniforms stood out brilliantly against the grey London backdrop as they marched with perfect precision. Sarah watched in awe as Private James Harrison, though she didn't know his name yet, took his position. Private Harrison was 25 years old, a fact Sarah would learn later. He stood perfectly still, his face showing no emotion, exactly as his training had taught him. His polished boots gleamed, and his red uniform was immaculate. The bearskin hat added nearly 2 feet to his already impressive height. Sarah couldn't take her eyes off him. There was something different about this particular guard. Perhaps it was the way he held himself, or maybe it was just her imagination. She noticed how, despite the cold, he didn't shiver. Despite the tourists taking selfies near him, his eyes remained focused straight ahead. The crowd around Sarah grew larger as the morning progressed. Tour guides explained the history of the palace and the guards to their groups. But Sarah already knew every fact they mentioned. She had studied everything about this tradition, from the weight of their bearskin hats, 1.5 pounds, to the length of time they had to stand still, 2 hours per shift. Little did Sarah know that her carefully planned tourist visit was about to become something much more significant. In her excitement and admiration for these living symbols of British tradition, she was about to do something that would change not only her life, but also affect the centuries-old protocols of the royal guards. As the morning wore on, Sarah felt an overwhelming connection to this place, to this moment. The crowds pushed closer, and she found herself moving nearer to the barrier that separated the tourists from the guards. Her heart raced with excitement, and a plan began forming in her mind. A plan that would soon make headlines around the world. The stage was set for what would become one of the most talked-about moments in recent Royal Guard history, though at this point, Sarah was just another tourist, watching with stars in her eyes, completely unaware of the chain of events she was about to set in motion. The morning had progressed, and the December sun now hung higher in the London sky, though its warmth barely penetrated the crisp winter air. Sarah Chen had been standing in her spot for nearly 3 hours, her feet growing numb from the cold, but her excitement hadn't dimmed even slightly. Private James Harrison had maintained his position perfectly, as he had done hundreds of times before during his 2 years of service. His training had taught him to ignore all distractions, the pointing fingers, the camera flashes, and the occasional silly faces tourists made while taking selfies. But something about this particular morning felt different, though he couldn't quite explain why. The crowd had grown considerably since early morning. Tour groups pressed against the barriers, their guides speaking in various languages, explaining the significance of the royal guards. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, pointing at the tall bearskin hats. The atmosphere was festive, like a street carnival, but with an underlying current of respect for the ancient tradition they were witnessing. Sarah kept checking her phone, not for the time anymore, but scrolling through the photos she had taken. None of them seemed to capture the magic of the moment properly. She wanted something more, something special to remember this day by. The elderly American woman, Martha, who had been chatting with her earlier, had left for lunch, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts. A group of teenage tourists pushed past Sarah, jostling her closer to the barrier. She stumbled slightly but caught herself. The movement brought her within a few feet of Private Harrison. From this close, she could see details she hadn't noticed before: the precise stitching on his uniform, the way his medals caught the light, and the slight movement of his chest as he breathed. The barrier between them was just a simple metal rail, about waist high. Sarah's heart began to race as an idea formed in her mind. She had read countless stories about the Royal Guard's discipline, how they never broke character, never responded to tourists. But surely, she thought, they were human too. Behind that stern facade must be a person who understood the admiration and respect she felt. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion, though it took only seconds. Without fully realizing what she was doing, Sarah ducked under the barrier. Several gasps arose from the crowd. A nearby tour guide called out, "Miss, stop," but Sarah was already moving, driven by an impulse she couldn't explain. 3 quick steps brought her directly in front of Private Harrison. The height difference between them was striking. She barely reached his shoulders without the bearskin hat. Time seemed to freeze as she looked up at his face, seeing the surprise in his eyes despite his maintained composure. Then, in a moment that would soon be captured by dozens of phones and cameras, Sarah wrapped her arms around Private Harrison in a gentle but firm hug. Her cheek pressed against the rough wool of his red uniform, and she could feel his body stiffen in surprise. The crowd fell silent. Even the usually noisy pigeons in the palace courtyard seemed to pause their cooing. Security guards began moving toward them, but they too slowed their approach, sensing something unusual about this moment. Private Harrison stood perfectly still, his training warring with his natural human instincts. In his 2 years of service, he had dealt with countless tourist interactions, people making faces, waving hands in front of him, even trying to make him laugh. But no one had ever hugged him. The warmth of Sarah's gesture contrasted sharply with the cold December air. Phones recorded from every angle as tourists watched in amazement. Some people covered their mouths in shock, others pointed and whispered. A child's voice broke the silence. "Mommy, is she allowed to do that?" Sarah herself wasn't thinking about the consequences. In that moment, all she felt was a connection to this living symbol of British tradition. She wasn't considering the rules she was breaking or the social media storm she was about to create. She was simply expressing her genuine admiration in the most human way she knew. The security guards were now just steps away. Sarah could hear their boots on the gravel. In the next few seconds, Private Harrison would do something that would change both their lives forever. But for now, in this frozen moment, they were just two people, one following her heart, and the other about to make a decision that would challenge centuries of tradition. The stage was set for Private Harrison's unprecedented response, one that would soon make headlines worldwide and spark debates about tradition, humanity, and the changing nature of royal protocol in the modern age. The palace grounds remained frozen in silence as Sarah Chen's arms stayed wrapped around Private Harrison. The security guards were just steps away, their walkie-talkies crackling with urgent messages. Every tourist had their phone raised, recording what they assumed would be another viral video of a royal guard remaining stoic in the face of tourist mischief. But Private Harrison was thinking of his younger sister back home in Manchester. Just last week, she had asked him why the guards had to be so serious all the time. "We're human too," he had told her. "We just have important traditions to uphold." Now, those words echoed in his mind as he felt the genuine emotion in this tourist's embrace. In that split second, Private Harrison made a decision that would eventually change Royal Guard protocol forever. He did something that hadn't been done in the centuries-old tradition of the Queen's Guard. He moved. Not the sharp, ceremonial movements that were part of his training, but a human gesture that shocked everyone present. First, his head turned slightly toward Sarah, breaking the famous forward stare that guards were known for. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Then, in a voice that was gentle but clear enough for nearby tourists to hear, he spoke. "Miss, I understand your excitement, but this isn't safe for either of us." Sarah immediately stepped back, her eyes wide with surprise. She hadn't expected a response at all, let alone such a kind one. The security guards, who had been rushing forward, slowed their approach, equally shocked by the guards' unexpected reaction. Private Harrison's voice had a Northern English accent, warm and reassuring, completely different from the rigid character he was supposed to maintain. His eyes, which had previously stared straight ahead, now looked directly at Sarah with concern and understanding. "I am sorry," Sarah stammered, her face flushing red with embarrassment as she realized what she had done. I've waited so long to be here, and you all mean so much to what Britain stands for." The security guards had now reached them, but they too seemed unsure how to proceed. This wasn't in any of their training manuals. One of them, Officer Thompson, gently placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. Private Harrison, having already broken protocol, made another unprecedented decision. While maintaining his formal posture, he continued speaking. "Your appreciation means a lot, but we have these barriers for everyone's protection. Please respect them." The crowd had grown even larger now, with people pushing forward to witness this extraordinary moment. Tour guides who had been giving their standard speeches about the guards' famous silence were frantically updating their narratives in real time. Martha, the elderly American tourist who had befriended Sarah earlier, pushed through the crowd. "Young lady," she called out, "come back here before you get in real trouble." Sarah nodded, allowing Officer Thompson to guide her back behind the barrier. Her face was a mixture of embarrassment and awe. As she crossed back over, Private Harrison did something final that would be replayed millions of times on social media. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement before resuming his traditional forward gaze. The entire interaction had lasted less than 2 minutes, but its impact would be felt for years to come. Tourists who had been recording quickly shared their videos, and within minutes, the first clips were already being uploaded to social media platforms. Some in the crowd applauded, while others stood in shocked silence. A young boy tugged on his mother's sleeve and asked, "Is he allowed to be nice?" The question would soon be echoed by media outlets worldwide. Officer Thompson, still standing near Sarah, spoke into his radio, presumably reporting the incident to his superiors, but his tone wasn't harsh or urgent. There was a note of uncertainty, perhaps even admiration, in his voice. Private Harrison had returned to his stoic pose, but something had fundamentally changed. The barrier between tradition and humanity had been breached, not with disrespect or mockery, but with understanding and compassion. As Sarah was escorted away from the immediate area by security, she kept looking back at Private Harrison. She didn't know whether to feel mortified by her actions or amazed by his response. Little did she know that her impulsive hug and his unexpected reaction would soon spark a global conversation about the role of centuries-old traditions in the modern world. The sun had finally broken through the London clouds, casting a warm glow over the palace grounds. It seemed fitting, somehow, as if nature itself was acknowledging that sometimes the warmth of human connection could thaw even the most frozen of traditions. The morning after the viral incident, a special meeting was called in one of Buckingham Palace's ornate conference rooms. High-ranking military officials, palace administrators, and royal protocol experts gathered around a long wooden table. Colonel Richard Blackwood, head of the Queen's Guard, sat at the head of the table, his decorated uniform perfectly pressed, his expression unreadable. On the screen before them, they watched again as Private Harrison broke centuries of tradition with his gentle response to Sarah's hug. "We have a situation that's unprecedented in our modern history," Colonel Blackwood began, his voice echoing in the quiet room. Private Harrison's actions have sparked a global response we couldn't have predicted. In another part of the palace, Private Harrison sat in a small office, still in his ceremonial uniform, but without the bearskin hat. Two senior officers were conducting a formal interview, their questions precise and detailed. They wanted to know everything: what he was thinking, why he chose to speak, and whether he understood the gravity of breaking protocol. "Sir, I made a split-second decision," Private Harrison explained, his voice steady despite his nerves. The traditional response would have been to remain still, but I felt that could have led to a more dangerous situation. Meanwhile, Sarah was being interviewed by palace security in a different room. Officer Thompson sat with her, along with two other officials. They reviewed security footage from multiple angles, asking her to explain her actions. Martha, who had refused to leave her side, sat in a corner, occasionally offering words of support. "I know I shouldn't have crossed the barrier," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I want you to know it came from a place of deep respect, not disrespect." Outside the palace gates, the media circus was growing. News crews from around the world had set up their equipment, broadcasting live updates about the Royal Guard investigation. Social media was now filled with speculation about potential consequences, with hashtags like #SaveTheGuard and #LetThemBeHuman trending worldwide. In the palace's public relations office, staff members were overwhelmed with calls and emails. Celebrity supporters were publicly defending Private Harrison's actions, while traditionalists demanded strict adherence to protocol. The palace's social media accounts were receiving thousands of messages per minute. By afternoon, the investigation had expanded to include reviews of historical precedents. Palace historians were consulted, ancient rulebooks were examined, and previous incidents of protocol breaches were studied. Some of the older guards shared stories of similar situations that had been handled differently in the past. Private Harrison's military record was scrutinized. His superiors found an impeccable service history, top marks in training, perfect attendance, and several commendations for his dedication to duty. This only made the decision more complicated. He wasn't a rule breaker, he was one of their best. In Singapore, Sarah's university had already received media inquiries. Her professors described her as a thoughtful, respectful student who had written several papers on British culture and traditions. This information made its way back to the palace investigation, adding another layer to their deliberations. As evening approached, Colonel Blackwood sat alone in his office, reviewing the day's findings. On his desk lay two draft statements, one announcing disciplinary action, the other supporting Private Harrison's judgment. The decision would set a precedent for future generations of royal guards. Officer Thompson knocked on the colonel's door with an unexpected piece of information. Public support for Private Harrison had grown even stronger. Tourist organizations were reporting increased interest in visiting Buckingham Palace, and veteran royal guards were coming forward to support their colleagues' human response. In the guards' quarters, Private Harrison's fellow guards showed their subtle support. While maintaining their professional demeanor, they found small ways to let him know they stood behind him. One senior guard quietly told him, "You did what many of us have wanted to do. Show we're human under these uniforms." The investigation team worked late into the night, weighing tradition against modern expectations, protocol against human connection. They knew their decision would impact not just Private Harrison and Sarah, but the future of royal traditions in an increasingly connected world. As London's streets grew quiet, lights still burned in palace offices. The investigation wasn't just about one guard's response to one tourist's hug anymore. It had become a moment of reckoning for an institution balancing centuries of tradition with the human touch of the modern world. The videos of Sarah and Private Harrison's interactions spread across the internet like wildfire. Within the first hour after the incident, the original TikTok post had already reached 1 million views. Sarah sat in a small cafe near Buckingham Palace, staring at her phone in disbelief. Her hands shook as she scrolled through endless notifications. Her own social media accounts were flooded with friend requests and messages from strangers. News organizations from around the world were sending interview requests, from the BBC to Singapore's national broadcaster. "Look at this one," Martha said, pointing to her own phone screen. The elderly American tourist had insisted on staying with Sarah after the incident. "They're calling you the girl who melted the Royal Guard's heart in Australia." Different versions of the video were going viral on various platforms. Some focused on Private Harrison's gentle response, others on Sarah's emotional hug. Social media users were adding music to the clips, everything from romantic ballads to dramatic film scores. Memes were being created at lightning speed, with captions ranging from heartwarming to humorous. In the palace's security office, Officer Thompson was dealing with an unprecedented situation. His phone was ringing constantly with calls from superior officers and media outlets. The palace's social media team was in emergency meetings, trying to decide how to respond to the viral moment that was garnering more attention than any official royal announcement in recent memory. #RoyalGuardHug was trending worldwide on Twitter. Celebrity commentators were sharing their thoughts, with many praising Private Harrison's human response. A famous British actor tweeted, "Finally, proof that there's a heart beating under that red uniform. This is Britain at its best." News vans began arriving outside Buckingham Palace, their satellite dishes reaching into the grey London sky. Reporters stood in front of cameras, repeatedly showing the viral clips while explaining the significance of a royal guard-breaking character. Tourism experts were being interviewed about how this might affect future visitor behavior at the palace. Private Harrison, who had been relieved from his post during the regular rotation, sat in the guards' quarters, being briefed by his superiors. His phone, stored in his locker, was vibrating constantly with messages from family and friends who had recognized him despite the bearskin hat. Back in Singapore, Sarah's parents were waking up to find their daughter's face on every news channel. Her mother's phone was ringing with calls from relatives and neighbors. The local newspapers were already preparing stories about the Singapore girl who changed royal protocol. Social media analysts were having a field day. One viral post breaking down the video frame by frame had received hundreds of thousands of likes. "Notice how he maintains perfect posture even while speaking. That's professionalism meeting humanity." Behavioral experts appeared on news shows, discussing the psychology behind both Sarah's impulse to hug and Private Harrison's choice to respond. This moment resonates because it shows that even in our most rigid institutions, there's room for human connection, one expert explained on CNN. By late afternoon London time, the video had been viewed over 50 million times across all platforms. Parody videos started appearing, people hugging statues, garden gnomes, and even lampposts, trying to recreate the viral moment. A popular comedy show quickly produced a sketch about other historical figures breaking character to give hugs. The Palace gift shop reported that sales of Royal Guard merchandise had doubled since the morning. Tourists were now gathering in even larger numbers, though security had been increased to prevent any copycat attempts. Martha sat with Sarah as the young tourist read comments on her phone. "I never meant to cause all this," Sarah said quietly. "I just felt so much respect for what they represent." Someone had already created a YouTube compilation of best Royal Guard moments, but Sarah and Private Harrison's interaction was being called the most meaningful one yet. Comments poured in from around the world, many sharing their own stories of moments when humanity broke through formal barriers. As evening approached in London, the story showed no signs of slowing down. News agencies were preparing their evening broadcasts, social media users were still sharing and commenting, and marketing teams worldwide were probably brainstorming how to incorporate the moment into their campaigns. Sarah finally put down her phone and looked out the cafe window at the palace in the distance. She had come to London hoping to experience something memorable, but she had never imagined becoming part of a moment that would touch millions of people around the world. 3 days after the incident, the atmosphere in Buckingham Palace was tense with anticipation. Colonel Blackwood stood before a specially assembled group of officials, palace staff, and media representatives in the palace's press room. The gold-framed portraits of past monarchs seemed to watch with interest as he prepared to announce their decision. Private Harrison sat in the front row, wearing his full ceremonial uniform. His posture was perfect, but those who looked closely could see the slight tension in his jaw. Sarah was seated a few rows behind him, having been officially invited to hear the announcement. Martha, who had become her unofficial guardian throughout this ordeal, held her hand tightly. After careful consideration, Colonel Blackwood began, his voice firm and clear. "The palace has reached a decision regarding the events of 3 days ago." The room fell completely silent, cameras flashing as photographers captured this historic moment. To everyone's surprise, the colonel's serious expression softened slightly. Private Harrison's actions, while unprecedented, demonstrated something we've long known but rarely acknowledged: that our traditions are strongest when they adapt to the times while maintaining their core values. Murmurs spread through the room as the colonel continued. The palace hereby announces its full support of Private Harrison's handling of the situation. His response showed not just quick thinking, but the kind of diplomatic skill that represents the finest qualities of the Queen's Guard. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she watched Private Harrison's shoulders relax ever so slightly. The announcement continued with unexpected news. The palace would be implementing new guidelines for the royal guards, allowing for limited human interaction in situations where safety or diplomatic relations could be enhanced. This decision, the colonel explained, reflects our understanding that tradition and humanity can coexist. Private Harrison will not face any disciplinary action. Instead, his response will be incorporated into our training as an example of excellent judgment under unusual circumstances. The press room erupted with questions. Journalists from around the world competed to be heard, their voices mixing in an excited chorus. The colonel raised his hand for silence before continuing. Furthermore, he announced, "We would like to acknowledge Miss Sarah Chen." Sarah's heart skipped a beat as heads turned toward her. While we cannot condone crossing security barriers, we recognize that her action, though misguided, came from a place of genuine respect and admiration for our institutions. The palace's decision made headlines worldwide within minutes. Social media exploded with positive reactions. Hashtag Royal Guard Victory and hashtag Tradition Meets Humanity became the new trending topics. After the formal announcement, a small, private meeting was arranged between Private Harrison and Sarah. In a quiet room overlooking the palace gardens, they finally had a chance to speak properly. "I want to apologize again," Sarah said softly, looking up at the guard who was now dressed in his regular military uniform. "I never meant to cause such a commotion." Private Harrison smiled, something he couldn't do while on duty. "Your actions led to an important change," he replied. "Sometimes traditions need a gentle push to evolve." The palace staff had arranged for tea to be served during their meeting, a very British way of marking the occasion. As they sat together, they were joined by Colonel Blackwood, who shared something surprising. "The number of applications to join the Queen's Guard has tripled since this incident," he told them. "Young people see it as a role where they can maintain tradition while being authentically human." Outside, tourists continued to gather, taking pictures with the guards as usual. But there was a new atmosphere of mutual respect. The barriers remained in place, but the invisible wall between guards and visitors had somehow softened. Martha, who had watched the entire ceremony, summed it up best when speaking to a reporter. "Sometimes the most rigid traditions bend not because of protest or force, but because of a simple act of human connection." As the day drew to a close, the palace released one final statement. It announced the creation of a new annual event where selected members of the public could meet and interact with off-duty royal guards, learning about their training and traditions in a controlled, respectful environment. The sun set over Buckingham Palace, its last rays glinting off the famous gates. Private Harrison returned to his post, standing as straight and proud as ever. But now, visitors who looked closely might notice the slightest hint of warmth in the guard's presence, a reminder that beneath every bearskin hat and red uniform beats a very human heart. 6 months after the famous hug that changed royal protocol, Buckingham Palace had transformed in subtle but significant ways. The morning sun shone on the same magnificent building, but the atmosphere was noticeably different. Tourists still gathered to watch the royal guards, but there was a new sense of mutual respect in the air. Private Harrison, now promoted to Lance Corporal Harrison, had become an unofficial ambassador for the modernization of royal traditions. He was selected to lead the first ever public education program about the Queen's Guard, where visitors could learn about their training and traditions in structured sessions. Sarah had returned to Singapore, but her impact remained. Her story was now part of the official palace tour guide's narrative. And here, guides would say, stopping at a specific spot is where a simple hug helped bridge the gap between centuries-old tradition and modern human connection. The palace had implemented its new guidelines with careful consideration. Royal guards were now trained in what they called diplomatic response protocol. One sunny morning, a group of military cadets from various countries gathered in the palace courtyard. They were part of a new international exchange program created in response to worldwide interest in the modernized guard training. Harrison stood before them, his red uniform gleaming. Tradition isn't just about remaining unchanged, he explained to the eager faces before him. It's about carrying the best of our past into the future. The cadets nodded, taking notes as he shared his experience of that famous December morning. In Singapore, Sarah had become something of a cultural ambassador herself. Universities invited her to speak about cross-cultural understanding and the power of genuine human connection. She always began her talks with a smile, saying, "I never meant to change history, I just followed my heart." The Palace gift shop had adapted too. Alongside traditional guard figurines, they now sold special edition models showing the guard in what they called the diplomatic stance, a subtle reminder that even the most rigid institutions could adapt while maintaining their dignity. Tourism had increased significantly, but not in the way some had feared. Instead of visitors trying to provoke reactions from the guards, there was a new trend of showing respect through proper observation and appreciation. Professional photographers captured this change in a series of powerful images that were displayed in the Palace Visitor Center. Martha, the American tourist who had supported Sarah throughout the incident, had started a popular blog about respectful tourism. "It's not about breaking traditions," she wrote, "but about understanding them deeply enough to know when they need to evolve." The impact reached beyond the palace walls. Other formal institutions around the world began examining their own protocols, finding ways to maintain tradition while acknowledging human elements. Military units, ceremonial guards, and even ancient temples started studying the Buckingham balance, as it came to be known. 1 year after the incident, the palace hosted a special ceremony. Sarah was flown in from Singapore to help inaugurate the Cultural Bridge program, which would promote understanding between traditional institutions and modern visitors. As she stood next to Lance Corporal Harrison for the official photograph, both couldn't help but smile at how far a simple hug had reached. The ceremony included a surprise announcement. The spot where the famous hug took place would be marked with a small, elegant plaque reading, "On this spot in December 2024, tradition and humanity embraced, reminding us that the strongest institutions are those that can adapt while holding true to their core values." As the sun set on that commemorative day, Lance Corporal Harrison resumed his guard duty. Tourists still took photos, children still pointed, but something fundamental had changed. The barriers remained physically, but the human connection had created an invisible bridge of understanding. Back in her Singapore apartment, Sarah kept a framed photo of the plaque on her wall. She had learned that sometimes the most powerful changes come not from trying to break traditions, but from approaching them with genuine respect and human warmth. The story of the Royal Guard Hub became more than just a viral moment. It became a lesson in how traditions can evolve without losing their essence. It showed that in an age of rapid change, the most enduring institutions are those that can balance their historical dignity with human connection. As new guards continued to train at Buckingham Palace, they learned not just about maintaining perfect posture and following protocols, but also about the day when a simple hug helped tradition take a step forward while keeping its feet firmly planted in history.